from the Institute of African Studies, Leipzig University, is interested in the sociology of knowledge practices, in particular, postcolonial linguistics, sociology of concepts, language philosophy, and science studies. Currently, she wonders whether and how non-representational theories could help overcome some ideas about language and representation deeply rooted in the Western history of ideas, thus contributing to a diversification of linguistic theory and decolonization at the same time. Dr. Beck, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for coming to listen and look. Wait, I have to open quickly my screen to you and start my presentation, and then I keep on talking. Okay. All right. So thank you very much, Sinfree and the African Studies Global Virtual Forum community for this opportunity to talk here. I will you will learn more about me when I talk, and I've always found it difficult to speak about myself. So it's easier to just get into things right away. So you can see a little bit about the outline. I will speak about complexity and classification. Then I will talk about sorting wire spaghetti in Zanzibar. And of course, my topic is always on representation. I'm looking for alternatives to representation, and I will conclude with some questions, more or less. So here you have 3 books. The last one, Africa and Urban Anthropology, that's where the article on wire spaghetti has just been published by Deborah Pello and Suzanne Scheld. But the other 2 books have been really, have influenced very much my thinking. I'm coming from a linguistic background. I've been trained in linguistics, especially in the German context, which there we would call it Afrikanistik, the study of African languages. And I have always been deeply dissatisfied with the notion of language dominant in that field. And Bauman and Briggs with Voices of Modernity, and then later on Marconi and Pennycook with Disinventing and Reconstituting Languages have been decisive in my thinking. And I'm, apart from what Phoebe just said, thank you very much for that, I'm also interested in understanding the role of academe locally and globally. And I would like to draw your attention that I will often speak about science, and this comes from my German background, where we just have Wissenschaft, which is inclusive of natural sciences and humanities. So I would use science and academe interchangeably. As a white scholar, I'm also very much involved, of course, in current debates about decolonization and alternative ways of scientific knowledge production. And I'm saying that because I think I have a responsibility as an academic, as a scientist in that field as well, especially as a white African studies scholar. So I want to start with the title of my presentation, Seeing Like a City. And of course, this is connected to Seeing Like a State. So Seeing Like a State is Scott, 1989, where he explains in full length how classification makes entities that are legible for and to the state. So if you're not classified in a way that the state can see you, you will not benefit, or the opposite, from the state. One good example are debates currently in Germany about the notion of race or Rasse. So for historical reasons in Germany, there is no way that the state would collect data about the ethnic or racial background of people, while on the other hand, people of color do actually want to be able to claim this disadvantage or discrimination. So you have the problem that race can make you killable, as in the case of Jewish people, or it can make you able to claim legal profit or support. So this is one of the things that Seeing Like a State entails. opposite is Seeing Like a City, and Nigel Thrift and Ashamin and Nigel Thrift, 2017, in Seeing Like a City, they are attempting to turn mess into complexity. And I find interesting what they are saying here about the city. I'm just actually reading the bold parts here. So whatever the geography of cities, they remain extraordinarily complex entities, a mangle of machines, infrastructures, humans, non-humans, institutions, networks, metabolisms, matter and nature, where the coming together is itself constitutive of urbanity and its radiated effects. And this was, this interested me, having gone into urban studies myself as a way of heuristics of detour, meaning that I try to get away from just language issues, linguistics, or description of languages, but then what you do instead. So doing work about the city was one possibility, you know, to work myself around those limitations of linguistics. And Ashamin and Nigel Thrift, they write somewhere that the city is a space that produces a new us, peopled by all manner of selves, only some of which are human. The goal is to produce a trans-entity pigeon, which provides just enough communication to induce a productive level of discomfort, which can lead on to new trans-entity forms and patterns. And I don't have an answer to what this trans-entity pigeon could be, but I find it really interesting to think in this direction, especially since we know that in the social sciences and humanities, language loses more and more influence, or questions of language. And I think that's some of the things I'm trying to, well, not heal, but to contribute that this could change. Okay. So sorting wire spaghetti in Zanzibar. I think I had some notes here, but they have disappeared anyway. So research for this article was was conducted in Zanzibar in July, August, and November 2018 and February 2020 in the context of a research project doing the city socio-spatial navigation in urban Africa, and it was funded by the German Research Foundation. And of course, we also had a research permit, an official research permit of the Revolutionary Government of Zanzibar. So my interest here, or it was more of a kind, there were like two things that happened one morning. One thing that had always been on my mind is that in actor network theory, Latour and colleagues would always say, follow the object. But what does it entail and how do you do that? And I actually I had been thinking for some time at radically following cables. I mean, really radically following the materiality of cables, and not metaphorically. And how can I follow them? What do I do? And is there a moment where I have to leave the cables? And so there was a morning, and when I'm sometimes on field research, I have bad days, bad mornings. I wake up and actually I don't want to speak to anybody and I just want to go home. And so I got out of the house and I started looking at cables. And this raises, of course, the question whether I can become with cables, and thus with Zanzibar and with the world. Can I world myself with cables? And this is a kind of course, experimental research. Yeah, so let me just show you a little bit of a video. You'll have to tell me if it doesn't work. There is no sound, I think, but that's not the important thing. So you can see this was one of the first videos that I made in Zanzibar. And you can see I'm following the cables here. There are water cables and electricity cables. And here I'm coming to a junction, and actually I don't really know what to do. So a lot of water provision in Zanzibar is done through those water pipes that you can see up here. Further up, There is electricity cables. These are still from colonial times. There is also CCTV cable. So you see, I'm showing here the electricity cable. Then you have telephone cables, CCTV cables, satellite cables, all kinds of wire spaghetti. Yeah. So now I'm standing here at this junction, and actually you can't hear that, but I've been discussing with somebody about all these cables and where they go, and then I decide, interestingly, where I'm going now. And I decide to go down this alley. I think now it is stuck. Now it continues a little bit. Sorry for this. The interesting thing is that as a colleague or a student of mine has just written in his master's thesis about water provision in Zanzibar, that the private providers have to pay for the usage of the walls. And this particular space here has changed in the 2 or 3 years that I visited Zanzibar, with particular reference to this one spot. So the branches are being chopped off, and cables are neatly tacked to the walls, and so on and so forth. So the interesting thing was, actually, when I tried to follow these cables, I couldn't find the beginning nor the end. Of course, there is one. Somewhere there is a well, and somewhere there is a tap. But walking on the streets, it was impossible. And when I was actually following the electricity cables, it was completely impossible. I tried to start with the transformator stations going backwards, or I started with the houses going forward, and there was neither beginning nor an end. There was not departure nor arrival, origin nor destination. A line of becoming has only a middle. And that was absolutely palpable. On the other hand, of course, there was a moment when there was an end, in a sense. And here you can see this is a tourist shop in Stone Town in Hurumzi, Zanzibar, where you can see that electricity meter where you have to pay for electricity. And that's where one of the cables would end. But of course, I couldn't see that because it's inside the wall. So actually, materially following cables has its limits. But what struck me most is when I gave a paper about sorting wire spaghetti in Zanzibar. So this is about a month ago, 1.5 months ago in Cologne, where I gave a paper on, amongst others, sorting wire spaghetti in Zanzibar. And this is a moment where the cables are not present anymore. And as Christine just wrote, yes, of course, in Brazil or in Greece or in all kinds of countries, you can see this kind of cables, but these particular, specific, singular, individual cables are not present anymore. So here I have to leave them. And what you get is only an image or a representation of those cables. And that is actually worrying. So, of course, we know all kinds of things about representation, but I find the The most important one is it rests on a fundamental difference between word and world. And representation is a relationship that stitches together, sutures, heals the severance of word and world. And it is the dominant mode in which we are able to think together word and world. It's the only, probably not, but certainly an important worlding instrument. Of course, we have very good instruments to understand what representation does. I'm thinking of Foucault, I'm thinking especially of Derrida and also of Butler or Spivak. But we have almost no ideas how to do things differently, how to think of the relationship between word and world in different ways, or whether we have to actually make that difference. And I'm working towards not having to make that difference. So this is partly a theoretical conceptual problem, but not only. So let's quickly look at what representation as worlding does. And some of the things I'm sure you know. So it's first the assignment of a word and a singular entity to each other, naming as an act of power. And then you have a stabilization or fixation of this relationship through abstraction, generalization, and universalization. So you have the inclusion and exclusion of meanings and materialities as an act of power. And then it's very interesting that the tie between word and entity loosens, because I can have like a glass here, and this word glass can become very mobile, and it can move into all kinds of different assemblages. But in order for it to do that, this tie between word and entity needs to be loosened. So what happens is just that the signified disappears, or can disappear, as an act of power. And then we have the mobility of the word. What also happens is a stabilization of the onto-epistemic relationship created in the mode of representation, and the difference between matter and meaning, which means an exclusion of material and ontological diversity. And then we produce a one-word world as an act of power, because we assume that the glass is always a glass, and there is one kind of glass, and there is only one way of perceiving of that glass. And of course, the words can differ, but they always make reference to one particular entity. So what does it have to do with language? As I said in the beginning, I have been strongly influenced by Bauman and Briggs, and they actually allow us to look into, to give a historical account of how this representational mode into which language is so much entangled came about. So they say language is an effect of enlightenment and modernity, and I think some of you should know that already. So enlightenment is a reaction to civil war and civil strife in England in the 18th century. And it entails a categorical reordering of phenomena and their relationships by drawing new kinds of boundaries between them and giving them new onto epistemological and moral political meanings. So, for example, before Enlightenment, it was possible during Mass to transform wine and bread into blood and flesh of Jesus Christ. After that, or nowadays, certainly we think of this as metaphorical, but it did not necessarily be that. So in that time, we also have technological innovation that allows for the objectivization of knowledge, and therefore language also needs to be innovated. And John Locke and David Hume, actually, they write a lot about this. Language had to match the power of experimentation and the prestige of Boyle's air pump for turning isolated particulars into universal icons. And language has to match the distanciation of the natural sciences, detaching language from the social. What we need are plain and simple words. And this is the moment where language as a neutral, objective, disambiguated, decontextualized, detached from the social and the natural, and autonomous object language actually emerges. And Francis Bacon in that time actually proposes an artificial language that would be able to match the Boolean pump. right? So that's very interesting. Bauman and Briggs then go on to describe that to this autonomous object language is attached a metadiscursive regime, that of plain and simple words. That regulated linguistic conduct and imbued some ways of speaking and writing with authority, while rendering other modes a powerful source of stigma and exclusion. And they say Locke created a new regime that required each individual to closely monitor his or her own linguistic repertoire and each and every utterance. Individuals who had submitted themselves to this linguistic regime earned the right to regiment the speech of others, to model linguistic precision and constancy, and to point out the errors of their fellows. So it means that those in the know and those in power, learned white men actually, display their adherence to the new ways of knowledge production by practicing the new metalinguistic regime. And of course, there is an inbuilt equality. Learned men versus women, peasants, children, and non-white people, of course, right? So the interesting thing is really that much of Locke's legacy has simply become common sense. And I would like to jump very quickly to academe, because I think that in many contexts, this metalinguistic regime, or this norm of plain and simple words, does not function, for example, in art or in our everyday talking and doings. But in academe, we have a very strong thrust or direction to follow this kind of plain and simple words, right? So you can see on the right side what Bauman and Briggs are writing about Locke and Hume's metalinguistic regime. And on the other side, you can see John Law writing about, critically writing about language use and representation today. So you can see the cheat and abuse of words is one of the notions that are used or brought up or coined by Locke and Hume. And this is negatively connoted, of course, because it embraces ambiguous, unstable, and shifting meanings, rhetoric, intertextuality, and could have the potential to transform words into sources of misunderstanding and vehicles for undermining the rationality and independence of thought, right? And again, here Law says descriptions are supposed to be direct. And we know, all of us, that this is somehow always a normative undertone or connotation to what we are doing. Words must be used identically by producer and receiver. And I remember in the 1950s and until today, if you look at communication studies, there must be an identity of producer and receiver. And of course, we have the gentle speech of noblemen or academics that we also find until today. And John Law says what is made manifest in such descriptions is constructed as being straightforward. More particularly, the reality made manifest is said to authorize the representation that seemingly derives from it. We can discuss later on whether you also think this is a valid argument. So Law actually talks even more critically, John Locke talks more critically about representation as othering. So he says the appearance of direct representation is the effect of a process of artful deletion. Law calls this othering. And of course, we all know in academe that when we write about something, you have to leave out a lot of other things. I think sometimes that scientific work or academic work is the art of leaving out everything except very little. However, people not in scientific power understand that representation leaves out important parts of reality, and they are wary and distrustful of hidden interests. So this is all John Law, right? They don't necessarily accept the boundary between that which is made manifest and that which has been othered by people in scientific power. And I'm very much reminded of criticism by Southern scholars And those in scientific power believe that lay people do not properly appreciate and respect science in its methods, especially with regard to the description of reality that has been found out there, which is in itself a gesture of power. But we have a problem. If we acknowledge that our accounts rest on normative ideas about reality and their descriptions, we have to give up on straightforwardness, clarity, coherence, unambiguity, replicability, and so on and so forth, all entrenched in modern science. And that's probably impossible. So I want to also say, of course, we know that language is not universal. We know this from Heriantu, from the volume of Marconi and Pennycook. Not all peoples have language in the sense we define it today. Or there is work about Japanese religion in Kinshasa by Peter Lamberts, who says, none of my interlocutors has ever tended to differentiate between the signified and its mediating signifier. Both are never thought as separate, which reminds us of the didactical and artificial nature of this distinction. So even semiotics is not universal, right? Okay. So I think I would like to say a little bit, yeah, I still have a bit of time, that's okay. A few alternatives, or working towards alternatives. So of course, I find alternatives mostly in heterogeneity, complexity studies, in the notions of rhizome, assemblage, and entanglements. And of course, we have post-structuralism, feminism, queer theory, which I haven't been reading so deeply, except maybe for Deleuze and Guattari and Foucault, and of course, a little bit of the others as well. But I'm actually more interested in science and technology studies, in complexity studies, post-humanism, non-representational theories, and spiderweb anthropology. I think slow science is totally underestimated. But what I find all of these approaches show us is that the question is how we look at the world. And I would like to follow here Karen Barat, 2007, Meeting the Universe Halfway, the world, and I write the L of world in brackets here to indicate that I mean both together. So the world does not exist out there. It is different interactions that produce different phenomena. Therefore, one can't simply bracket or ignore certain issues without taking responsibility and being accountable for the constitutive effects of these exclusions. And I would like to demonstrate that very briefly here. This is also taken from Karen Barat. This is a quantum physicist's experiment, and you can see here the experimental setup. So in the 1940s, Stern and Gerlach at Frankfurt University, they devised an experiment where they had an atom beam going through a double magnet, and then they expected that the atoms would land, the silver atoms would land on the screen in 2 dots, right? So here we have Gerlach. He was the rich guy of the 2 of them, and this is Stern, and he was actually the brains behind it. But they were both working at Frankfurt University in the physics department, one I think in applied physics and the other one in theoretical physics. And Gerlach was the one who knew Henry Goldman, whom we still know today from Goldman and Sachs. And he knew Albert Einstein, and he got money, and they were able to get silver and buy silver, but they had a hell of a time to actually cook the silver into atoms so they could shoot them through these magnets, through this apparatus. And actually they had almost nothing left. This could be also one of those hero stories. But finally they managed. And they looked at, they thought the experiment had succeeded, and they took this screen from the wall, and they looked at it and couldn't see anything. Now this is where the cigar comes into play So I said, Gerlach was the rich guy and Stern was the poor guy. So in those times, professors would smoke cigars, and the rich professors would smoke good cigars, and the poor professors would smoke cheap cigars. And cheap cigars would have been processed with lots of sulfur. So the breath of Stern was sulfuric. And the moment he looked at the screen, the two dots appeared, because he was male and poor. And it's not just the setup of this kind of experiment that made the experiment succeed. Now, just imagine these would have been women who don't smoke at all. Their experiment would have failed. And now there are two interpretations. Of course, we could say, well, the experiment hadn't failed because only if you had better measuring instruments, then they could have seen that the experiment was successful. So it's a question of knowledge, and that would be the Heisenberg interpretation. But Bohr has the interpretation to say, no, this is also, then the experiment has not succeeded, right? And Karen Barrett follows the second side of it. So what we can see is that it makes a difference. Gender, class, and of course, race, if race was not prominent here, but this, of course, it's inbuilt, do make a difference, and they make a huge difference. So I have another, what I'm actually up to is to say that we as researchers are implicated and deeply implicated in what we are doing. Or in other words, what I want to say also is, depending on the notion of language we operate with, this notion of language, of course, is also implicated in what we are doing and how what the results look like. So with this, this is another small snippet from my research, where I want to show that words are objects, just as the buckets are objects here, or anything. This is also a small film, and I will just talk across it in order to save a little bit of time. So what you can see here is a doctor coming. This is 2014. There is no vaccination against Ebola, and this is so this doctor comes now from the treatment center, from the red zone, and he needs to be decontaminated or disinfected. And this is a moment of actually an extremely dangerous moment. And what we can see here is that you have a body. He is standing in the sluice, and there is a body who also gives the orders: turn, lift foot, open arms, and so on and so forth. So my argument here is that words and buckets are assembled here. And the buckets, they may come from the local market, and the words come from regulations laid down by the WHO or whoever has produced them. And words and buckets play an existential role in executing safe decontamination, right? So wash hands, and you can see here how he knows what he's doing because he has been trained, and still there is a moment of high control. And what we can see also is that words start to be just as buckets. If you think of words like buckets, then words become independent, just as the buckets are autonomous beings. There is danger in this kind of thinking, huh? But the point I'm trying to make here is that words can be integrated into a praxeological analysis or in a science and technology studies analysis without making reference to specialized analytical inventories borrowed from linguistics, social linguistics, and so forth. But they can be treated like any other entity in an assemblage. So I have another example of mattering, and I've been wondering how deep I should go into this topic. So, but maybe the most important thing is that difference is not taken for granted. and that these are the apparatuses, as we said, with the Stern and Gerlach apparatus or experiment that create mattering difference through interaction. The thing is that interaction would mean that we already have entities that get into a relationship, right? But what Karen Barad suggests is that there are no pre-existing relata, but they come into existence by open-ended material discursive boundary making practices. So the thing is, if I am the one in Zanzibar making connections, choosing at the corners where I go, choosing also with whom I speak, choosing what to show you and what I don't show you, then all these choices, they matter. And here there is a small example of, I don't know how I should say that. So this is, I'm not thinking anymore in representing, but in mattering and mattering forth, right? So we have here a small example, and you will see in a moment that water is dripping from this water pipe. So this is like the city second nature, where the human being has nothing to do, or is not an agent in this lush garden. Sorry. But then this gives me the opportunity that I don't have to, even if I follow objects, they are no longer objects, but they are matter in their becoming and mattering forth with me and with Zanzibar. I don't have the problem of translation in a Latourian sense, and I don't have a problem anymore with representation. So this is a storage room of SECO, of Zanzibar Electricity Corporation, and this is another photo of this. So words can matter as much as humans, more than humans, objects, and entities. And I don't make an a priori difference between words and world, but relations that come to make a difference. So worlding, with extra this L in brackets, is in a constant becoming as material discursive practice, and I don't need anymore to, at least conceptually, to make this difference between word and world. And I don't rely, or I'm no longer forced to rely on representation. So let me quickly conclude. So let me get quickly back to the Zanzibar case study. In a sense, the experiment has failed because I always have an active role in this. I have to decide at junctions. I have to decide what to tell you. It's my responsibility which Zanzibar I produce, and I'm always entangled and implicated. And in following cables, I had to compromise. I was forced to leave the cables at a point, and I had no other possibilities than to enter power-saturated configurations, starting with representations. And the next step was, of course, to ask how we think or believe, how we conceptualize the world, how it works, and the role language plays in it. And I've just told you that with mattering forth, I no longer need to rely on the representation. But nevertheless, I think the world thinks differently. So I'm not alone in this way of thinking. At my chair, we are experimenting very much with this kind of worlding and cutting together a part of Karen Barad and so on. But if we go back to representation as underlying science, and I mean, of course, natural science and humanities, The question is, are they fundamentally flawed, or can we heal it by making it better? Because science is so much imbued with power. And the scientific power, according to Eliseo Macamo, the scientific power to speak truth is pervasive. And this apparatus is actually very large, because I would also include financing, institutions, buildings, students, professors, the real world, journals, and so on and so forth. And of course, we are implicated. But for me, it is so the one thing that we could see with the physicists' experiment, you can make class, race, gender disappear, and that is an act of power. But to make them reappear and be accounted for is also an act of power. And that, for me, is the strength of science and the emancipatory potential of science. And then it is not about self-reflexivity, but it's about responsibility and responsibility. Yeah, maybe I think I stop at this. It's enough. I'm sure we're getting into discussion in a moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beck. Thank you so much. Professor Makoni, it's your turn.
Rosemary, thank you very much. Let me start by saying just two things. And it's interesting you're making reference to the work of Barat, because she's going to come and present at the Global Forum. I can't remember when, but sometime in
Great, we'll be there.
So it would be nice to have you around. I'll make sure that I send you double invitations, right, when she comes. Now, my question is this. The thing that struck me in your presentation was, when I was with you at the University of Leipzig, some of your students and another junior colleague presented a paper which I thought was making a claim that words have agency. Am I correct? Now,
yes.
Yeah. What I want you to explain to me and perhaps the audience is how is that approach of words having agency? How is it compatible at all with the arguments you are making about non-representational approaches to language? Or are you and your colleagues going in different directions?
Should I answer?
Oh, yes, it's just a conversation.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think the idea that words have agency comes from this analysis of the Ebola treatment sluice, Ebola decontamination sluice, where you can very clearly see that you can actually look at words as buckets, like in a very similar sense. So there clearly words have agency, and there was another part of the video which I didn't show you, where you can see that words do make a difference in the movement of the doctor while decontaminating. I think that does not go so far beyond what you have in conversation analysis or things like that, right? The other thing I want to say, of course, we always have I mean, I'm not against representation. I want to say that very clearly. I just think it's not enough to think with representation.
Yes.
I think we need to go further than that. And the interesting thing with my colleagues, so they have this project of words crashing into bodies.
Yes.
Yeah. So what they are doing, actually, we have this the debate. I think that's not unique to Germany, but that's unique to decolonizing debates, that certain words hurt people. And some of these words you can predict, right? You don't say the N-word if you don't want to hurt somebody. Yeah, that's clear. So we don't say that anymore. But sometimes there are words that hurt even if you don't want that. So they have this example of a Somali writer in Italy who goes with her Italian friend to a wine festival, and she looks at the fountain in Rome, and she sees this fountain is carried the central post of the fountain, I don't know what you call that in English, is carried by 4 slaves. And the Somali friend tells her Italian friend, do you see this? And the Italian friend says, yes, it's beautiful. And that's the moment where this word beautiful hits the body of the Somali person. Now, this you cannot explain with representational words. I mean, you can explain it with I'm sure we'll have to deal here with cognitive stuff, with psychology, of course, and there are lots of things have been said there as well, that's clear. But how do you then, if you come from a language perspective, how can you explain that? You can't, because a representation does not hurt. Yeah, so it's about the agency of the words that is in the foreground, right? And what we can see, maybe if I can add, what we can see is that the human being and the word in the Ebola decontamination sluice, the human being and the word are being detached from each other. Yeah, because of course the person, the body spraying the doctor, she says the words, but they are not her words. They are as much her words as they are her buckets standing there, right? She's the one that utters them. But if we remove, or Latour says somewhere that the human being excels, or the most striking property of the human being is to appropriate the agency of objects, things as his own, as their own. And this happens also with words. And if you remove the human being from the words, as we can see in that sluice, it's extremely dystopic, right? It's a very dystopic imaginary of the human being. Yeah. I don't know exactly what to do with that yet.
With that yet, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, let me follow this, then I'll come back to myself. When you talk about words having agency, I do not focus on what you didn't talk about. I don't focus too much on the work by your other colleagues, because I'll come back to your own. Is it possible that the idea of words having agency, the idea of words being animate, is more characteristic of a particular type of register, let's say like scientific discourse, that is more, you're more likely to encounter words having agency in scientific discourse than in the other ordinary type of discourses that we use? Would you buy the argument that says that one of the defining characteristics of scientific discourse is to make words have agency so that we can subordinate humanity to words? I want to make to enhance the scientific status of this text. So I have to make the words have agency.
Well, I think I would like to clarify 2 things.
Okay.
First, what agency means to me, and it is very fundamentally make a difference. That is also the definition by Latour, and it doesn't entail what you call it.
I see what you mean. Okay.
There is no. Oh my God! Somebody help me. Absicht.
Intentionality.
Intentionality. Exactly. Yes. There is no intentionality attached to this. The moment the human being appropriates the agency of words, it's always connected with intentionality, right? So you have to actually say human being plus words is equal agency plus intentionality. I mean, if you want to put it this way, this is very simplistically. And I'm not sure whether words are animate. I wouldn't go that way. No, I wouldn't say that. Then the question is about words having agency on their own. Actually, it's very difficult to find these moments. So this, I serendipitously stumbled across this Ebola decontamination sluice, and I think this is not. It's not the usual way of thinking about words. Yeah, it's like a specific moment where you can see this, but usually it's human beings speaking. It's human beings. It's scientists who sign the article with their name and take responsibility for what they write there, right? Okay. So the words are still connected to a human being. It's not that the words would be independent or have an agency of their own.
Okay.
Interesting question.
Okay. Now let me get back to myself, the intellectual trajectory of my own ideas. Would you argue that Marconi and Pennycook in 2007, in spite of their critique of language, were fundamentally caught up in a view of language that assumed, that accepted the representational value of theories of language? Is this invention an example of a representational account of language? I'm trying to find a way out of that impasse myself, but I want to talk to you about it. How does it come across, disinvention, non-representation, and representational views of language? Where do we fit in? Is disinvention an example of representational views of language, or disinvention has the potential of creating a non-representational view of language?
Well, actually, it's an interesting point you are making. I read the book and the articles, and more in the context of invention of tradition. Yes. Terence Ranger and Hobsbawm.
Yes.
You clearly show that language is an invention, and you have to work through this kind of invention to show that language is national. The state needs language.
Yes, yes.
State needs a language. So language becomes a national project, and you can see that in education. In education, you also need a language, right?
Yes.
All of these things. And I think for me, the most important thing about your book was to understand that language is not universal. Right?
Yes, yes.
That was for me the most important thing.
Yes.
I think I'm not sure. I didn't read your book as being concerned with representation and non-representation, but I might have to look again. So do you think so? Did you struggle with this question of representation then, and I didn't see it?
No, I didn't. We didn't, in actual fact. We get quite impressed when people say also that it is a critique of Western tradition of notions about language. I didn't know enough about Western traditions of language to level a sustained critique of how language has been philosophized through law and all that. It was basically an account of how ideologies of languageness emerged in specific context. And that was what we were describing. Then subsequently, it was a question of describing that you can have a tradition of language practices which does not necessarily need language in order for that to take place. And that language will then get tied to literacy and all things like that. That's basically what, at a very simplistic level, what the argument was. But how is that argument evolved over time? It has evolved over time because we are now, I think, at another level where we talk of language as being completely emergent. It is always what? Evolving. It is always coming up. And that language is useful as a second order category, as an analytic heuristic for analyzing communicative practices. That what you have first is communication, and then language as a way of analyzing communication, right? That I think is where it makes more sense to me. That's why the idea that not all communities need language or have language, but that does not mean communities don't communicate. They communicate, but not all communities are preoccupied with analyzing linguistically that communication. Right.
Well, I think you see that the problem that I actually have whenever I talk everybody can say, haven't you read Derrida? Haven't you read Foucault and Spivak and the philosophers and all the philosophers? And I think that at least Western society is absolutely preoccupied with language so strongly that we cannot imagine that there are societies which are not interested in language. And I think there is a colleague from Germany, I've forgotten his name, who wrote about Amerindian languages, where he says, I have did work in a group that never thinks about language, right?
Yeah, it's Hoke and Fury, yes. Hoke and Fury, yes.
Yeah, so I think the problem we have partly is that we just add on to another layer and another layer and another layer onto language, which is why I'm trying to get out of language and doing this detour, this heuristics of the detour through tables or through the Ebola decontamination sluice, because then I'm not always preoccupied with language, right?
That's true. Because what has happened here is that because as linguists or whatever, we are preoccupied with language, we assume everybody in the world is preoccupied with language. But that's not true at all.
That's not true.
Most people go around the world without being worried about language. I'm not saying it's not important. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a job. Bob wouldn't have hired me if I didn't think it was important. But I don't think most people. But anyway, let me stop. Right, let me hand over to Phoebe.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. We can continue talking about it.
I'll come.
Yes, you must come. You must come to State College. Rosemary will be coming to State College, spend part of her sabbatical with us. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Makoni. So, Professor Beck, we have a few comments and questions.
Okay.
I'll start off. The first one is a comment from Michael Scott. And this is regarding the beginning of your presentation. He shares that he talked about the occurrences and implications of cables in various geographies and political contexts. And his comment is that all these communities involved develop their own rich oral streetwise vernaculars to come to terms with lives immersed in the spaghetti and the struggle for life's essentials. He calls this a fertile sociolinguistic ground. So that's his comment. I don't know if you have anything to say in response, otherwise we can move to the next question.
Is this in the chat? Yeah.
Yes, in the chat. It's all the way in the top.
All the way in the top?
Yes.
Okay.
He was just making a comment about.
Yeah. I think what you are, all the communities involved developed their rich oral streetwise vernaculars to come to terms with. Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe you could explain what you mean with social linguistic ground here. That would be interesting for me. Maybe. Because after all that I've said, I don't know what you mean with social linguistics then.
I think I'm basically thinking back to the whole series of these fora that I've been attending here, and this particular global vernacular studies forum, where a range of social political issues are discussed here, and always, or quite often, maybe usually, with a connection to language as it's being developed and analyzed by sociolinguists. I'm not a sociolinguist, and I can hardly define what. But I think a group of people here can do that. May have some sense of what I mean when I throw out the word. That was my hope.
Yeah, but I think I would like to, it gives me the opportunity to say that actually I'm not interested in social linguistics. I'm not even interested in linguistics or any of these things. What I'm interested in is actually to integrate words, if you want to say so, into the study of anything. Because what I observe, on the one hand, you have the linguists that are of all kinds, right? In the whole breadth from socio to anthro, whatever. They are preoccupied with language. but the other disciplines mostly, they don't think about language at all. So this is such a gap. And actually, I want to be one of those who doesn't care about neither linguistics nor sociology or anthropology, or at least not fall into this trap of making a difference between words spoken or written and the lived world, right? So that is always my problem. How that there is, I mean, we have inherited that in European history of ideas from Socrates, if you want, yeah, that we always have this difference between word and word, at least at an analytical level. At the lived level, we don't have that necessarily, yeah. But this is actually where I want to go. Yeah, thank you for the comment.
I think you're totally in line with this forum. Maybe I express myself in a very wordy way in that chat.
No, but I think this is very hard also. You know, it took me maybe 20 years to get where I am now. To be able to say I'm able to think without representation, without this gap between word and world. And it's only sometimes that I manage. Yeah, it's so deeply set into my way of thinking and of all of scholars probably. Yeah, it's very hard to overcome. And I think today during my presentation, actually, I was happy. I managed, maybe for the first time.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a next question from Judith Baker, who says, when most African languages are deemed not worthy of being learned in or taught, how does your theory relate to decolonization?
Yeah, okay, thank you for this comment. So just to clarify, on the one hand, I was not speaking about African languages, and if you have not actually said one word about African languages in my presentation, my point is rather to say the way we think about language in the Western paradigm needs to be decolonized. And I made a suggestion how to do that. Now, the idea of African languages itself is the effect of colonization, because European linguists came to Africa, and this is described in Joseph Errington's book, 2009 or something, where he describes how Western linguists come with their analytical instruments, and they come and look at those beings, and they say if they have language, they are human beings, and then they find language, of course, right? And then you have the evolution of the study of African languages, which is interested in finding more and more and more and more African languages. And there is a lot of identity politics attached to that, and so on and so forth. So I would say the existence of African languages, the way we know it today, and I'm not saying people don't have language, but exactly in the way that is described in Makoni and Pennycook's book, or with Heriantu, the way we know language today is a Western invention, and in that sense, African languages are also an invention, which does not mean that today most African languages are deemed not worthy of being learned or taught. That is very clear, and I would like to draw attention to a research project that I'm currently having with here in Germany, and we are having a conference in 2024 about education and African languages, where this is exactly the question. Not why, right, but how can we actually make African languages relevant again? And the short answer would be to say, well, African languages, or any language, comprises knowledge and onto epistemological onto epistemological knowledge. That's a doubling of words, I'm sorry, which are not easily accessed through, or we need to access that. This is heterotopic knowledge, which is getting lost, or which we need to try to get access to or to retrieve, especially in the times that of social and transformation and the Anthropocene. So my theory itself does not relate to African languages, but of course, we need also to decolonize the teaching of African languages. I don't know whether this helps.
Thank you. If Judith has something to say, we'll take it, but otherwise we'll move on to Christine's question.
Yeah,
Christine,
please.
Christine thanks you for the inspiring presentation and says, how can the materiality turn in language studies contribute to or deal with absences, silences, and spectrums such as memories, ancestors, dreams, and non-human communication?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think this is exactly the next question that comes up, because these are moments where we can actually look beyond the confinements of language. So silence, absences and silences, I would look at those the context of practice of silence and practices of absences. This would be the one thing. So for example, if people are just sitting silently next to each other and nothing happens, then there is no silence, unless somebody says, why are you so silent? Or somebody says, they are silent. So you need kind of a definition of absence. So it becomes absence, right? Yeah. And anything, so you see, if I'm not making this difference between word and world anymore, but if I speak about worlding, then of course absences, silences, and spectrums are there normally. They are, or naturally, they are there. Naturally, they form part of what we are looking at. And there I would maybe argue also a little bit with Deleuze and Guattari to see what pops up. Yeah, is absence or silence popping up as a topic in the research? Because theoretically, anything can pop up, anything can be there, and silence is just as material as the word, or as language labor, right? I find it difficult to. I'm not there. I find interesting the memories, ancestors, dreams. Non-human communication, this is actually, we can see that with animal communication becoming a big topic in some contexts of with indigenous studies, for example. I think I don't see a contradiction here, but I can't give you good examples. Christine, maybe you would like to comment or elaborate.
Yes, I was just wondering, for example, thanks a lot, Rose, that was very nice presentation. I was just wondering, for example, about indigenous concepts of language and how silence can be understood from those perspectives and not from our perspective. I mean, how far can we go in dealing with these notions of silence and absence, and if you take into consideration, for example, this materiality concepts of language, and what is material and what is not non-material from our perspective. Yes.
So I find that when we speak about material, non-material, we run into trouble with language and words. But if we speak about matter and mattering, then it becomes different, because matter is something that is socially produced, right? And words matter. And it's the relation between our lived surroundings, the relations that I'm producing, that matter. And words are just part of that mattering. So I'm not even sure whether I would say I'm into this materiality turn. I'm maybe more into the mattering turn. Yeah. So maybe that is probably the more interesting way to go, because otherwise we are again running into that trouble that word and world are somehow different from each other. The world is material and the word is not material, maybe apart from waves, sound waves, or my tongue that is moving. But we miss the social aspect of it. And with the materiality studies, we fall totally into this trap. But if we start thinking with mattering, I find that much more interesting. I've not thought through, right? I'm on my way there as well. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, this is something. So I would also say we need people doing research on how non-European people, or indigenous people, sorry, would conceptualize words, silences, memories, ancestors, and so on. But for that, we don't only need indigenous people who can do that in their own communities, but we also need people who are aware of all the layers that are their academic heritage, right? So that is more often the problem which I see, that my African colleagues, or any colleague for that matter, their way of thinking is so much organized around this word-world gap that it is very difficult, that you are stuck, even if from your own cultural background where you come from, you are stuck in this Western way of thinking. And that is very difficult. And I don't have I think we need exactly such studies like Makoni and Pennycook did with, or Heriantu did, or I had this citation of Peter Lamberts with the Japanese religion. Or there is, I've forgotten his name, with whom I cited with the Amerindian languages, right? So we need these kind of studies, plenty of them, that give us access to these heterotopic ways of speaking about the world. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Christine. There is some silence. If there are no other comments, we will invite Dr. Makoni for his closing comments. Marie, all right, hold on. Marie has a hand up. Marie,
yes.
Marie, you can go.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a quick question about mattering and interaction in relational ontology. I really like Karen Barad and Donna Haraway's work, but when I read Haraway's book, mattering in the end felt like sort of lacking social political dimension. Relational becomes mattering in relation to you and the worlding. And it just sort of concerned me that you know, in this sort of politically contentious age, particularly in the US context or in Europe, isn't that the missing that kind of dimension? It is sort of like, it sort of bothers me. And if you can comment on that, it could be my misinterpretation.
No, I think that is why I like to combine Barad and Haraway, because what Haraway shows us is this becoming with this very localized political work, but which in the end remains punctual and individualistic, right? So that is kind of what I see, and then it gets depoliticized. So you have a single, so she has, for example, in, I don't remember, is that Staying with the Trouble, where she does this research with doves, right? And the small local community. So you mobilize a small group, and it needs to start there. That's right. But she doesn't show the larger effects, or the larger repercussions of potential of this kind of work. While I find that Karen Barad makes it very clear that it is our responsibility, that we are responsible. And I like Donna Haraway's wordplay with responsible and responsible. So responsibility is something that I have personally. But the way Karen Barad puts it, at one point she says very clearly, you know, it's not about being self-reflexive, being conscious of your positionality and all these things, but it's about the responsibility you have in the way you do research and the way you do science, right? And that is why I have a different problem here. I have a problem with the connection or the boundary between activism and science, which I find difficult because I've not been yet convinced of how you can do that. But to understand science as activism, that's what I want. That's where I would stand, in the sense of Karen Barad, that I am responsible for what I'm writing and what I'm doing. And it starts, for example, with I'm sorry, I have to bring up this example that in African studies, of course, you have plenty of literature from before, even, I mean, 20 years ago, probably people stopped, scientists, European anthropologists and so on, stopped using the N-word, right? But this is a responsibility that I have not to use that. I mean, we can put it down to something like small like that, but it has huge repercussions. Or if I tell you that I don't agree with this notion of language, I mean, that's really destabilizing. If you start thinking through, it totally destabilizes our world. Yeah, and that is my responsibility. And in that sense, I am an activist researcher, or for me, science is activism in itself. Yeah.
Is that sort of something recent in Barad's work? I know she wrote about something about political discourse recently, but is that really obvious, like in her 2007 book, even? It's something I missed?
I think it's in one of the later chapters, right? But I must also say this is maybe inspired, or what I'm saying here is inspired more maybe by Barad, because for me it is, you see, for me it is clear that science, and I mean Wissenschaft holistically, since modernity, science has entered a complicity with the state, and it has been extremely successful, right? And it is probably one of the most successful ways of knowledge production and then innovation and so on and so forth. But there is a lot, and this is not just African studies and not just linguistics, but it's, for me, this is much broader. So when we start criticizing science, we are starting to criticize in a very fundamental way the foundations of our world, right? And I find this is and actually this is not just crazy, but for me in the Anthropocene and the moment we are right now, in the historical moment we are right now with climate change and increasing wars and energy crisis, and we have to change to green economy and so on and so forth, right? I can see that we need science, we need to defend science, which brings me in a problem whether I want to make better science or whether I want to change science altogether. I don't know, but there is my responsibility. And for me, the responsibility is always in this freedom of science that we have. And that is the strength of science. That is the actual strength of science. And that is what we need to defend. And I don't like the complicity of state and science and so on. And I actually don't know where this is going. I just think that the consequences are enormous. And I can't think that alone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that dialogue. Christine, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, it's just a last question, very simple. Well, I was just wondering, since we have so many cable systems in different parts of the world, so why Zanzibar? Why is it so relevant for your research and your theories and analysis? So just a curiosity.
Okay. Actually, I didn't say a lot about the Zanzibari cables. So you could see that there are electricity and TV, telephone, CCTV and water pipes. And we know that from colonial times, you have the electricity cables. And it is about after 1980, with the liberalization of economy in Zanzibar, that those water pipes start growing, and CCTVs. So this is really a neoliberal phenomenon, which has got to do on the one hand with decreasing investing in infrastructure by the government of Zanzibar, or there was financial difficulties and so on and so forth, on the one hand, and the needs of people for water. And that is when these bundles start growing. So this is not so much a sign of underdevelopment, for example, but of neoliberal politics. That is maybe something you can see there very clearly. It is also interesting that infrastructure that we start out when we talk about the infrastructure, that infrastructure is it's under the ground, it's hidden from plain sight, which is not the case in Zanzibar. And very often we have this kind of interpretation that's about poverty and so on and so forth, but maybe it's a different way of thinking about infrastructure, right? And one can read up David Larkin about infrastructure in Nigeria, and he would say things like that as well. Yeah. So we can actually see that. So this study of my student shows very nicely how this has become a local business of drilling water wells and selling the water to neighbors by installing pumps. Sometimes it's private business. It's also attached to mosques in Zanzibar in particular, where you can go and fetch water. And I would know that there are hotels who also hand out water in terms of sadaqah, or in terms of what's that in English? Like, oh my God, I'm sorry, about almsgiving. Sorry, yeah, something like almsgiving even. So it's in a complex context of water and society in Zanzibar that we see those cables. Is that a little bit? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beck. Professor Makoni.
Yeah, Phoebe, before I talk, I want to ask Bruce, because Bruce is in Tanzania at the moment.
Yeah.
How do you, yes, Bruce knows Tanzania more than a lot of people. How does this, from your political science perspective, what was your take on this, about cables in Zanzibar?
Yeah, it's interesting. My wife's also involved in construction and building, so
okay.
I appreciated the metaphor. No, it's interesting. I guess kind of more practical things is, is anyone still using telephones, with a line? No. Or maybe we're having these things that need to be taken down or stay there. I don't know. But
yeah,
no,
I mean,
go ahead.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things that in some places they take down the cables, the satellite cables or telephone cables, and in other places they don't, right? So it really depends on the local entrepreneur, what he does with the walls. Yeah. But it's also interesting to observe dripping. Yeah, so you have this kind of second nature of cities through dripping. And you have up on the walls, you have like tomato plants growing on the walls. And so it's really, if you start noticing, you start walking differently in Zanzibar, or probably also in Dar es Salaam.
Yeah, I don't know. The place where I am, a lot of the stuff is underground.
Okay.
The water and stuff, and then when people are digging gardens and stuff, they keep on breaking the.
And then let me ask Vicky, how does that sound from the Kenyan perspective? Are you in Kenya or still in India? Vicky is not there. Okay, let me ask Ashraf.
Thank you so much. Let me just thank Rose first for her nice, useful presentation. Rose, I liked the last 2 or 3 minutes from your intervention, because particularly after the questions by Christine and Christina, another colleagues, because it took us into the, I think this is the point of, well, I just need to remember the name. Yeah, it's about the politics, because, you know, talking about mattering and matters and complexity and assemblages, sometimes there's a danger that, you know, social relations are flattened, you know, politics is wiped out of the equation. Now in Zanzibar, but there's no talk about poverty, no talk about Ebola, the politics of Ebola. We're just talking about, that's why I think the question of Christina, do you know what centrifuges? You don't need to go to Zanzibar. You can stay in Europe.
Exactly.
Thank you. Yeah, the similar situation also in Sudan. Yeah. But again, the question of politics should always be there. When we talk about mattering and these post-humanist trends, we always need to think about the question of inequality. It's not enough to say that language is entangled with the reality. But again, what's the effect on the lives of people with this entanglement? Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for this very interesting comment. Because one thing, you see, what I've been thinking about this problem of flattening. So yes, you are right that I'm flattening some kinds of differences. I'm trying to flatten out the difference between word and world. And then I try to see where difference emerges, right? So I know exactly that with my perspective, there are some differences that I can't see, which is also good, because otherwise my perspective would be totalizing. And that's, of course, not what I want. Yeah. So what I'm offering is to flatten out some things, which happens with this notion of agency, for example, to make a difference. This definition of agency as to make a difference, which flattens out intentionality and all kinds of things. But then the question is, what do we see when we flatten out this difference? Then other differences start to emerge. And actually, you are right. I mean, you can do this research in Zanzibar or any other place, which brings me into trouble as an African studies person. Because any kind of research that I can do it elsewhere. I don't have to go to Africa. What Africa helps me is to become aware of different perspectives and of heterotopic knowledge and of you know, but I don't think I am the one who can do that research. I am the one who can ask the questions because of flattened out some things. So yes, I think you are right about flattening out poverty, but if you what I just said about the cables. So from a Western perspective or a Northern perspective, to have cables on the walls is a sign of poverty. But from the perspective of Zanzibaris, it's not about poverty. Yeah. So if you start, if we start changing perspective, then other differences will pop up. And I'm always interested in these stowaways, right? In those things that we bring along and we don't even realize that they are there. And that's always the case, right? So I'm always those stowaways, those conceptual stowaways, they are the ones that make me fire up.
Thank you.
Thanks for this comment about flattening.
Dr. Makoni, you're muted.
Right, and I was asking Emmanuel or anybody else, Ephraim, do you have any comments that you want to make? Or Cliff?
Can I wait till the after party?
Jump in, Anis. Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to go in at the after party, because what I have to say is very much like the wires in Zanzibar.
Yeah, okay, it doesn't matter, jump in, yeah.
All right. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much, Professor Beck, because honestly, this is such an important subject that you're talking about. And I think it's rather brave and courageous to come up with it, but it's an essential thing to look at. Now, what I have here, listening to you, I'm just absolutely fascinated. And it's a little bit jumbled up, so you'll have to bear with me. Talking about, the polycrisis that we are into, I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name. It's Bruce somebody, a scientist who was working on global warming, came up and said, we've been spending a lot of scientific time looking at it, but what we need is spirituality to deal with these issues. Now, to go back to the point of the divide. Now, in the Western culture, there's a very great history of division. Even pre-Descartes, where you divide the body and the soul and everything. Now, my experience of other languages, like if you look at African languages, they're based on Ubuntu, I am, because you are. You are, therefore I am. If you look at the Somali Italian example, if you come from a culture like the Ubuntu culture, you're very aware. There is an element of consciousness of the feelings of the other. So these distances are the divisions of the Western mental creation. Whereas the rest of the cultures, for example, even in the Arab world, for example, Ashraf will bail me out on that. The language of hospitality, you don't divide it, it's there. So, language and culture are not really studied separately, but everything is that oneness that we have so lost in the Western world. Even individual, like self-knowledge is very important in most of these cultures, and self-knowledge involves everything. You have to know the rivers and the trees and others and yourself, you're all one. Whereas in the Western world, it's a culture of individuals. Hence, every subject is divided. And then talking about truth, science is the only area where you can, I'm in conversation with a philosopher at the University of Cardiff at the moment, and we've been discussing truth. What is truth? The only area where you can spot truth is science, where you prove something right, and that's the truth. But then 10 years on, that truth is no longer the truth. And here I'm looking at, the emerging points coming from the lack of consciousness. Whereas most of the languages that we're talking about, where there are these divisions, are very heavily based on consciousness. Like, for example, Persian, has a lot of tehzeeb, the culture is very, very important. And how you use language, and it comes into every area. So, I could go on, but I think I'll stop there because, it's, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting comment. So Ubuntu I am because you are, this relationality and the problem with this bifurcation or binaries in Western thinking. Recently, I gave this paper or a version of this non-representational stuff because I'm really working on this and with other colleagues, and there somebody said, but it's not that like that in Europe. It's not this bifurcation or this this I am because I think, ich denke, also bin ich, je pense donc je suis, this kind of thing. I think there is this one point that becomes much clearer to me the more I think about it, and it's about academe. So I've today also spoken about academic language and not about everyday language that we speak in German or in Swiss German or whatever. So if I go to the farmer in my home area, I'm not sure whether he would have this kind of Cartesian bifurcation of body and mind, of being, of language and knowledge and all these things. I'm really not sure. Actually, I'm quite sure this is not the case, because a few years back, they were digging a well and they didn't get water. So these were construction people. And then the old farmer was sitting there and said, they didn't find water, right? And the old farmer said, they didn't find water because they were digging while the moon was going down, right? So I doubt that we can speak about Western culture. I think we have to speak about Western elite culture, Western academic culture, right? And there I absolutely agree that we have that problem. But in all the other fields, I think we can speak about relationality, we can speak about spirituality. Only people don't like to speak about spirituality in Europe or in Germany, in my context, with me, because I'm the scientist and I'm normative. I'm a scientist, I'm rational, I haven't got anything with spirituality, right? And I see that with myself, that I'm getting kind of nervous when I have to speak about spirituality. Yeah.
What I would like to add to that, you're absolutely right. I'm not saying that all Europeans are in that divided culture, because, you know, there's an awful lot of people, if you go into the, you know, the farming areas and
Anywhere. Yeah.
They are spiritual, they are grounded, they're very conscious, they're connected. But you're right that, you know, we're talking about the elitist, rather, it's the knowledge, the Western knowledge. You know, like, I mean, you cannot depart from the Cartesian ideas. They are there in the educational system. There is a divide.
Exactly.
So as you had that schooling, the old farmer is still very much with the moon and the stars and the, you know, like I was at a conference the other day where we were all talking about how do we celebrate the summer and looking forward to the autumn and the relevance of the seed, etc., in our lives. That's still going on. But when you look at that, you know, the education system, or I don't know how to put it, the developed intellect, that's when, if you look at society today, people are so self-centered rather than being centered in self.
Nice.
And if you look at these other languages that we're talking about, they're all very centered in self, the way people speak them. The other is important.
Okay. Now let me try and sort of ask Cliff and then Unyere, then we can wrap this thing up. Unyere, I better ask you so that you don't get upset with me that I'm not being generous enough. I know you're hiding behind your screen. What's your take on this?
Well, I'm actually multitasking. Okay. It's a very, I'm sorry I came in a bit late, but from what I can glimpse, first of all, it's very interesting. It's different because we usually, you know, we're so stuck in our ways that looking at things from a different perspective seems to be, you know, the exception rather than, you know, the rule. I don't know if I have much to say.
No, that's fine.
I have much to say about this, but it just, listening to the speaker, it just sort of took me in a different direction. And all this week I've been working on a piece of art that I'm doing for someone. And so while the speaker was on, I went back to the work, you know, to sort of look at it a little bit differently than, you know, I originally planned. So I don't know if there's a connection there, but it just moved me in a different direction with regard to what, you know, I've been doing all week. So
What a wonderful thing to say.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
I'm so happy that this happened to you while I spoke. No,
Yes.
really, I think this is absolutely fantastic. Thanks. Thank you.
Yes. I mustn't say this, but I'll say it in public anyway, and Unyere will get upset. Unyere is also a poet, but don't ask me whether I prefer her poetry to academic writing. I will never disclose that in public, but she writes wonderful poems as well, right? Which is nice. Cliff does a lot of running as well. He's a marathon runner. Okay, Cliff, what's your take on this before we wrap things up? Cliff is quiet. Okay, yeah. Otherwise, I think what I can say is, Rosemary, thank you very much for this. This has been very enlightening, and I can only echo what Unyere said, is that it forces us to think in a different way. And I'm really looking forward to Karen Barad when she comes to talk, particularly with the background that you have, particularly with issues about the work of Karen Barad that you were raising. It will be very interesting to listen to her. And then Kim, can you tell us who is coming next?